So in August of 2016, there was a famous piece in the New York Times that said basically it says Trump lies and violates the rules. Journalists will have to violate the rules in order to cover him. And it was a little permission slip. I wrote about this in my book, Broken News, where it was a permission slip to journalists basically to say, well, he's throwing the rule book out the window. We have to throw the rule book out the window too. How did that work? Poorly, as it turned out, extraordinarily poorly. So we have the bookend to that piece in the New York Times, how Trump's allies are winning the war over disinformation. And it goes on and on and on, and talking about how there was this magic moment after January 6th where it seemed finally that the federal government, private entities would team up to fight disinformation, but they were defeated in their effort to bring government power to bear on the question of disinformation and misinformation. And I was so obsessed over this, I wrote my whole Dispatch Tuesday column about this. The idea, so basically it goes like this. There were a pair of cases at the Supreme Court this week that were dealing with these kinds of questions. One was about the New York Attorney General or New York Department of Financial Services or whatever, trying to scare people away from insurers from doing business with the NRA. That seems pretty straightforward, that the government can't do that. More complicated one involves the attorneys general of Louisiana and Missouri who are suing the federal government for jawboning social media sites into taking down posts about Trump's false claims about the election or COVID. And on both sides of this, so on the right-wing side of this, you have these folks who say that people have to be forced basically to carry content they don't want. That Facebook or Meta or X or TikTok or whatever have to host speech that they don't want to host. On the other side, and of course that is preposterous because the First Amendment makes it clear, not speaking is your right too. You can't be compelled to carry the speech of other people forward. On the other side, we have this disinformation and misinformation stuff, which is that the government has a role to play in policing speech and forcing people to take down. So the short form is the right wants companies to be forced to leave speech up, and the left wants companies to be forced to take speech down. And in both cases, they just plow right into the First Amendment because you just can't get around it. It's not Section 230. It's not something new. It's something old, which is the desire of people for the government to police speech is so longstanding that when in order to pass the Constitution, they needed a Bill of Rights. And in the first one is the government can't police the speech of its citizens. And the thing that's galling about this New York Times piece is it's like, that's your job. That's what you're supposed to do. You're the New York Times. You're writing for the most influential publication in the world. You want to fight disinformation, go fight disinformation. Go do that. And the New York Times, by the way, does a lot of that. To their credit, they are chasing down stories and reporting stuff and spending substantial resources. But don't complain that the government is not helping you do your job, right? Because the government's job is it has to be limited to, and I made the point, I'll shut up, I promise. But I made the point about flip it around. What if Stephen Miller of the Trump administration had been cooperating with media outlets on speech about Black Lives Matter or speech about environmental radicalism or speech about anti-Israel people? And he was cooperating to fight disinformation that could lead to violence from people in this space. What would the, by the way, correct response from the New York Times be? This is outrageous. They can't be doing it. This is jawboning. This is shadow censorship. They can't do this stuff. So I would just tell everybody, however you think the government ought to be involved in policing people's speech, remember it won't always be people you like. And if you give the government power to police speech, directly or indirectly, it will be used against you later. So just do your job, put out the truth, fight the good fight, stay out there in the trenches. This is not a part of the government's job.
There were a couple things that really bothered me about this piece. The first is there's a sort of like tacit premise that if Trump wins again, his victory in the disinformation wars will be a big part of it. That he will have won because people were misinformed or disinformed, which is BS and patronizing. And the second was there was so little grappling with the fact that the guardians of disinformation, misinformation have totally discredited themselves by trying to stamp out what is in fact true, newsworthy information. And they go on to quote Nina Jankowicz, a researcher who in 2022 briefly served as the executive director of a short-lived DHS advisory board on disinformation, which people were critical of. They didn't want a government body policing information and misinformation, and who herself had been critical of true news stories that were put out because they were harmful to Democrats. And there's just no grappling with the fact that these people have totally discredited themselves and proved untrustworthy in the eyes of so many people.
Yeah, again, it can't be us. This is not us, right? This has to be somebody else's mistake. This has to be somebody else's problem. And I read this piece as basically, so you lost, right? So who lost? You lost because you don't feel like you are getting the outcomes that you want. So that's on you. That's on us, right? And that's why I'm proud to work in the places that I work at the American Enterprise Institute, the Dispatch, and News Nation, and doing the work that we do, because the answer to bad speech, right, and wrong speech and misinformation is good speech and reliable information. This is where the battle of ideas has to be fought. This is in the marketplace of ideas. And just the last thing I'll say before I shut up, I promise, is if we cannot trust voters to make up their own minds, it's game over anyway, right? If we have concluded that the American people have to be spoon-fed correct information in order to make the correct choices, then the premise of self-government is already over. So you have to accept the fact that this is a nation in which the government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. And if the governed are deemed incapable of reaching conclusions about things, then go plant turnips because it's all over, baby blue.